reminder. All right, Camryn, I'll let you take it away.
Okay. Mm, Share my screen. Okay. So for those of y'all who don't know me, my name's Camryn, and I'm the Texas policy intern. And we've been working on policy proposals for the last couple of weeks once we finished up our toolkits. So today I'll just be doing a quick presentation over the usage of feed supplements in Texas to reduce methane production in cattle. So just a little bit of context for y'all who don't know about the Texas cattle industry. We are the leading state in cattle production in the United States. So we make up around 13% of the cattle inventory in the United States. So we're a pretty big chunk of that number. We have over 12 million heads of cattle. The Texas cattle industry brings in an estimated 12.3 billion in revenue, and is a huge contributor to the Texas economy. So lots of jobs in agriculture, lots of jobs in the cattle industry. A lot of people here are really reliant on it and aren't willing to say goodbye to it. So the cattle industry or the ag industry here contributes to 7% of the United States annual emissions. And then on a global scale, 6% of the yearly greenhouse gas emissions can be credited to the world's 1.5 billion cows' digestive systems. So that's a large chunk of greenhouse gas emissions just from cows. And we have a lot of cows on this planet. So just a little bit about what causes cows to, they actually belch methane. So when they burp, they release methane. So it's a part of their digestive system. All ruminant animals, it's just the way their stomachs are. Breaking down plant material is very mechanically heavy. So when the plant material goes in, bacterial digestion and fermentation happens, which produces hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And then there's an enzyme, methanogens, that combines the hydrogen and carbon dioxide to create the methane. And the methane has to go somewhere, so it goes out and it gets into our atmosphere. So that's just how cows work. Unfortunately, they're huge methane producers. But not to worry, there is a seaweed supplement that's native to places such as Hawaii and Australia, and it grows in the ocean. So when the seaweed is fed to ruminant livestock, cows, sheep, goats, those types of animals, any animal with a four-chambered stomach, it can act as an enzyme blocker to prevent the combination of the hydrogen and carbon dioxide, which is what is released as methane. So only 0.4% of the cow's diet needs to be replaced by the feed additive to reduce the methane production by 90%. So just 0.4% of the cow's diet is replaced, and they're producing way less methane. And that's, obviously less methane going into the atmosphere. So this type of seaweed can be grown using sustainable aquaculture methods to avoid harvesting from the wild. Currently, if we were to take it from the wild, it would be very damaging to the ocean's ecosystems. So lots of companies, one I'm going to talk about is called Blue Ocean Barns. They're actually growing this on land in labs, and it has the same effect on the cattle. So it's a very controlled method of producing it. And it's a much better way than having to take it from the ocean, because for 1.5 billion cattle, if you want to take this on a global scale, that's not going to be enough anyways, and we're just going to destroy the ocean. So there are sustainable aquaculture methods to grow this. So in California, the Department of Food and Agriculture has actually approved the use of the red seaweed as a feed supplement for livestock. So they've researched this method, and it works for the cattle. There's not a taste difference in any of the meat that is produced or dairy, because you can also use it for dairy cows. and they have actually been able to implement a grant program for methane monitorization and reduction incentives in their budget. So it's very involved in the California government. And they've allocated a total of $5 million in grants that supports the measurement and progress for livestock methane reduction projects. So they're giving money to their farmers to monitor, to use this red seaweed, and it's been approved and it's going really well in California. So that being said, I would like to, my policy proposal, the point of this presentation is I would like to propose a task force in Texas to gather research over a 2-year timeline on this new red seaweed supplement being used to reduce methane production in ruminant animals. So this task force would be a part of a larger mission to get a grant program in place that incentivizes feeding the supplements to cattle. In the long run, you want farmers to promote the use of this to have a long-term effect on the climate. You want it to be used forever. So that's kind of the goal, is the task force would be gaining the information, the proof in the pudding that this actually works, to show Texans that this is a great feed supplement for their cattle, and it really only has positive benefits. Javen and I talked about this in one of our meetings. Texas government is very heavy on incentives rather than regulations. People respond a lot better to incentives rather than regulations. So I think this would be a great easing into things to promote the use of the red seaweed, because if I were to promote a regulatory program to say, hey, you have to start using the red seaweed, there's fines, blah, blah, blah. I don't think it would go over well with a lot of Texans. A lot of the ranchers are pretty conservative here, not a lot of change, very traditional. So I think this would be a great way to ease our way into things. And then lastly, I just have a little bit of food for thought for how this policy would be implemented. So since California allocated $5 million in grants, I think that would be a great starting point for our task force to invest into research. So possible funding for this, instead of asking the government directly for money, I think grants would be a really good option from the federal government, from private foundations. So USDA has a lot of agriculture innovation center grants. So research going into new ag products that can make it a more sustainable industry. The EPA has grants for climate change research. There's new funding programs under the Inflation Reduction Act going into these climate change grants. So that would be a great place to look for funding. And then private grants as well. Something really interesting that I found while researching was that the David and Lucille Packard Foundation have actually funded a research project through UC Davis. So for this feed supplement. And I thought that was really interesting because they've given a grant to us recently. So I just thought that I'd put that in there. And then some ideas for who would be on this task force: definitely a grant writer to specialize to get the funding for this program, because it's going to be heavily reliant on grants. I would love to have the Future Farmers of America Youth State President involved to promote this idea of using feed supplements to suppress methane emissions in cattle to the next generation of farmers. Representative from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They do a lot of regulation with emissions. They have a Texas emissions reduction plan right now in place. So I would love for them to be involved. If we could get funding from that program as well, that'd be great. The Texas Department of Agriculture, Blue Ocean Barns representative. So this is actually the manufacturer currently of the red seaweed. So I'd love to have them involved so they could help guide us on what's the most sustainable way of doing this. And then, they would benefit as well because they would be providing the seaweed supplement in the future. And then just legislative sponsors who can guide the research into the next phase of legislation. So once we have this, all this information on how it works, how can we get this grant program in place in the future? Um, so yeah, that's my policy idea for Texas. And thanks for listening. I really loved doing my internship at the Climate Initiative, and I've learned so much about policy. My background is not in policy, so I've learned a lot. So thank you all for listening. I'll stop sharing.
All right. Thank you, Cameron. We have a few minutes, maybe like 7 minutes before we'll pass it off to Hunter. Oh, where did Hunter go? I guess I'll check with him. But yeah, does anyone have any questions for Cameron?
I really
Yeah.
love, oh, Louise, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Julia. Go ahead.
I really love your idea of incentivizing the farmers instead of telling them, because I'm just thinking of like other human beings that I know whose livelihood doesn't depend on something. And when you're trying to get them to do something, how much more exciting and willing they are if it's like, oh, you get to do this. Guess what?
Yeah.
You get to do something. It's like, oh, me? So I love that idea. That's a really great thing to include.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question is like, what's your sense in terms of, is the farmer's hesitancy to do this really just cost driven? You know, is it a price thing, and or are there other aspects going on that you haven't touched on?
Yeah, so I think so this is a pretty new study within the past, 3 to 5 years, with farmers actually using this and there being like an incentive to use it. Right now, there's not enough of the seaweed to go around. So I'm not sure a lot of the farmers even know that this is a possibility, especially in Texas, where we're, a very conservative state. So there's not a whole lot of promotion of these new technologies. So I think the task force, it'd be great to get, local Texas farmers involved as well, just to spread the word. And then the incentive, of course, with agriculture right now, there is a cost burden in being in that industry. So taking that away for the farmers, I think would be really beneficial. And eventually, once there's more production of this, more people are using it, the cost of the seaweed will actually also go down. And so then the incentive program can be phased into some sort of regulation far down the line.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right, yeah. And then my other question is like, because I know one of the issues is that the red algae is currently grown in other countries predominantly. And so I know there's been research, or people have started to look into more like native or local algae species that could be used. Is that did you come across any sort of, has anybody made any inroads as far as that's concerned at all? Did you come across that in your research?
I didn't come across that yet, but that actually is a really great inspiration that has me thinking, is there something on the Texas coast that we could be using? I know down in Galveston, the seaweed is like, if you've ever been to Galveston, there's seaweed everywhere. It smells like seaweed there.
I have not
So
been.
yes, so if there's some sort of seaweed species down there, the seaweed I talked about in this proposal in Blue Ocean Barns, they're located in Hawaii, which yeah, so it is a US, state, but it is very far away, and the transportation cost would be very costly on the environment as well with emissions. So I think that would actually, I didn't find anything in my research on a different type, but here in Texas, maybe we could add that to the task force to research, is there something off of our coast that we could use? And it would also control the excessive seaweed on our coastline. So yeah.
Well, awesome presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are
It's really, oh, sorry, Jamin, go ahead.
no, go ahead. I was just gonna ask, are there any other?
Mine is just another statement. I couldn't believe that percentage that you shared, that less than half of 1% is all that's needed to change the methane emissions by 90%. That's wild.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
I know
really
that's
crazy.
still a lot when you multiply it by what you said, 12 million head of cattle,
Hmm.
but that's still, I mean, it feels very attainable when it's something that small.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why, like, I think promoting it and making it more accessible to farmers, there's really not a downside except for maybe on the production side of the seaweed that could be more sustainable, but it's a very easy implementation for the farmers to do. And yeah, who wouldn't love a 90% reduction in methane emissions just from a herd of cattle? You know, it's the little steps along the way that are going to make a big difference. So I think that's a really, good thing.
Yeah, and you talked about implementation, and I think that for other presentations, people might stop at this is a great technology. We need to have it in the we need to have it for all farmers. But the reason why the policy proposals I think are so important is because you take this research, you take this technology, and you look at how the government can make it accessible to the communities that these programs need to get to. So I'm glad that you took it that way. I'm glad that you looked at several different options from funding. I know we talked about that. And I'm glad that you took this technology and took it towards implementation.
Thank you.
I think you did really great.
Thank you, everyone.
Are there any other questions before I pass it on to Hunter to present his? All right, if not, Hunter, feel free to take it away.
Okay, so I'm Hunter. In case there's anyone here who hasn't met me, I am the Louisiana policy intern, and I'm doing my proposal on a cap and trade program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Louisiana. So let me get my screen shared. All right, can everyone see that? Okay. Okay, cool. All right, so what is cap and trade? Well, under cap and trade, Louisiana legislators would limit or cap the overall amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted each year. By essentially putting a price on carbon emissions, cap and trade would hopefully encourage businesses to look for ways to cut their fossil fuel costs, which would reduce the demand for fossil fuels without risking the image of an overbearing government necessarily. So the biggest challenge will be inevitable pushback from the oil and gas industry, which has largely been left unchecked, especially in the South. And so how would it work? Well, the government could initially auction off emission allowances to the highest bidder or allocate them for free, either to firms that need them directly or, as in a 2009 federal House bill, to government entities that would then sell them to firms and use the proceeds to fund public services. After the initial allocation, firms can then, or firms that can reduce their emissions cost effectively could sell excess allowances to other firms. And so auction systems are more expensive because they do require a larger upfront of credits, but the proceeds from the larger capital that's circulating are greater than the allocation system. So to ensure compliance with the cap, the state government would require the firms that the cap covers to hold government permits or allowances for those emissions. And so this is just further differentiating the two systems. Under an allocated system, a government regulator decides who gets allowances under these factors. While in an auction system, the market essentially makes decisions on who gets allowances via a periodic auction forum similar to like Facebook Marketplace for credits. And so the general approach is to allocate credits to those with the highest willingness to pay. At least the market allocates those credits. So choosing between auction and allocation depends on stakeholder interests. Auction systems do give large preference to big players in the market like utility companies, because they necessarily have more resources concentrated in those areas, whereas typically you get plants where they, like more often than not, are operating in multiple areas, so they don't necessarily have the resources concentrated in that single area. And for Louisiana, that would essentially increase the power of the utility companies here, which are already pretty powerful. But auction proceeds do benefit the general government revenue more than allocation systems, which could then be used to invest in climate-related programs or economic development programs, anything like that. So why cap and trade? Well, downstream or source emissions cap and trade is the most politically feasible climate policy in Louisiana, according to the LSU Center for Energy Studies. So far, policies that have been based on market-oriented principles like cap and trade have been more politically long-lived than administratively determined approaches like your standards and taxes. And so basically a quarter of world emissions are from places with cap and trade, while about 6.5% of world emissions are from places with a tax. And also because Louisiana could generate up to $1.6 billion for the state, which is a lot of money, especially for a poor state like Louisiana. However, it is important that any revenue that goes towards that we get from these proceeds goes towards one-time payments, like maintenance backlog down payments, for example, rather than a consistent expense, so that the state doesn't become reliant on essentially the proceeds and stops lowering the cap, because the lower the cap is, the less proceeds you get. However, cap and trade is an imperfect solution. At best, it has low to medium outcomes across these different categories. And the worst offender, to me personally, is its medium to high gaming potential. So essentially, credits are legal property rights that can be traded in the market, and they create a value for emissions. So property rights are essentially commoditized, and that becomes difficult to regulate, which leaves a lot of wiggle room for rule bending, which is not good. But there are other U.S. regional cap and trade programs. I have 3 of them listed here, along with all of their member states. I won't read them all out to you. But we can start with the Western Climate Initiative. So essentially, this was started in California, and it covers a larger percentage of the economy than these other 2 programs. And despite this larger coverage over the other 2 programs, it still performed about the same economically. The worst market consequence was like a modest increase in the price of gasoline. I want to say it was maybe 4 cents, which isn't worse than the usual volatility of the oil market. California also uses much of the revenue that it gains from the WCI for highly public and visible projects, which reinforces support for the cap and trade program. However, only the electricity sector saw emissions decrease, despite the fact that the program covers more than the electric sector, which is an important caveat for Louisiana, because our most important sector for emissions reductions is the industrial sector. And then you have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which covers these states, mostly on the East Coast. And so these are just 2 highlights from this program. It was the most successful out of the 3, but I'll just go into detail on these 2. So essentially, studies into the program suggest that every dollar invested will create about $2.75 in lifetime benefits. And that's a really broad category. It can be anything from quality of life raising to like actual economic savings, like gas prices. And so the RGGI's member states saw pretty substantial economic growth relative to other regions in the United States. And although that economic growth is likely due to global factors beyond the cap and trade system, its above average growth relative to the rest of the country does show that a cap and trade program can exist without damaging state economies. And then you also have the Midwestern Regional Greenhouse Gas Reduction Accord, but there wasn't too much information on it, despite the fact that it was created around the same time as these other 2 programs, around like 2007. Yeah, so there are plenty of criticisms with the cap and trade program, the most important of which is that the firms under a cap and trade system buy credits rather than reduce emissions. And the firms able to afford the most credits tend to be located and near and pollute low-income communities. But there is a potential policy solution to this. The state of Washington modified its cap and trade program so that regulators can halt the sale of credits if their price falls too low, and so that the state can intervene if carbon pricing by itself is not driving down pollution in at-risk communities. Opponents of cap and trade would rather have strict emissions limits and strong enforcement, regulating carbon like other pollutants rather than giving it special treatment and creating an entire market around it for gradual reductions. And they also call for cutting off fossil fuel development, which is contributing to global carbon emissions that the US can't regulate. I think in a perfect world, this is the ideal solution. But the fossil fuel industry's influence over legislatures and the dependency of many families on fossil fuel jobs makes that improbable, particularly in Louisiana, where both of these problems are severe. Essentially, a lot of people in Louisiana have to decide between trade work and plant work, and a large percentage of them do choose plant work. So critics also point out that credit trading and offsets built into the policy create a pay-to-pollute scheme, whereby a firm can buy carbon credits and invest in an environmental project out of state rather than address the pollution that's creating in its backyard. For example, instead of reducing their emissions, many of California's biggest companies kind of just stockpiled allowances by paying for projects that planted or protected trees elsewhere, with the idea that those trees would sequester carbon from the atmosphere. However, many climate activists have rightly criticized that approach, as there's no way to guarantee that the offset projects actually perform as intended. And so I personally think that offsets present a large loophole in the system and would likely need to be eliminated entirely if they couldn't be strictly regulated to apply to local communities and their performance ensured. So just to conclude, cap and trade, it's really not meant to solve the climate crisis by itself, but it is likely the only viable option for Louisiana currently. The U.S. regional markets in place today were created about 10 years ago, and we've learned a lot about how they work and they don't work since then. The loose standards were necessary then to garner support and buy-in from legislatures and firms. But with the RGGI's positive impact, this may not be necessary anymore. I think it's entirely possible that a new regional market, such as one created in Louisiana, could start out a lot more strict standards wise than these previous programs did, which is one of the biggest criticisms lobbied towards the cap and trade program. However, the standards were always planned to become more stringent and are becoming stronger the next decade. So we'll see in the next 10 years if cap and trade is a viable program, because we've essentially had to spend the last 10 years just sort of waiting to see if they would even work or if they would crash and burn. And so 10 years later, they are still standing. They just haven't done much. And that was kind of by design, essentially, like I said, just to get people to buy into the programs. And now we'll see in the coming years if they are actually effective. However, where viable, cap and trade should still be accompanied by other policies, such as your straightforward carbon taxes. That's just not necessarily viable here in Louisiana because, like I said, we have an extremely strong dependency on the oil and gas industry, similar to what Camryn said with Texas on the agriculture industry. But yeah, that's everything. I have a lot more information in the Louisiana Toolkit folder if you're interested. I have all my research written down. This was sort of just the bigger highlights, but yeah.
All right. Thank you, Camryn. Do we have any questions or comments from the audience?
Go ahead, Julie, if you have a question. I was just wondering, thanks, Hunter, for this presentation. You mentioned that for the Western Climate Alliance that they tended to use the revenue for sort of bigger public facing projects. And I was just wondering if you could give an example of what type of project that would be.
I actually didn't write that down and I really should have, but I'm if I remember correctly from my research, some of the projects were, I want to say like renewable energy investment, or even actually as straightforward as economic development programs, like workforce programs, affordable housing initiatives. It was the idea was that the investments would go into as front facing an investment essentially as they could. So yeah, I think it was definitely more front facing things like economic development programs and affordable housing rather than sort of like abstract general revenue returns or things like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Hunter. I have a couple questions. I know we talked about this is such a complex issue, and that I wanted you to think a little bit about, like, our audience is young people and how we can get young people engaged on policy issues like this. So if you were to like boil down this issue into something that, let's say, TCI ambassadors in Louisiana uh, would be able to, bring to their community in a community conversation like this, like, how would you explain it in maybe a 30-second pitch on why a policy like this is important?
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think at its most basic, a cap and trade program is essentially like a little marketplace for carbon emissions, and the goal is to get the industry to buy into the program without having to tell them to buy into the program. Essentially, it's the idea is to create like an economic incentive to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions if you're a firm. I think at its most basic, that is what a cap and trade program is. It's essentially like monopoly money to get people or to get firms to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah. I think like thinking through that monopoly money example, I think could be like really engaging, just in terms of uh presenting it in a way that like young people understand. But I think that, with an issue as complex as this, I think you've boiled it down pretty well. And I think that it's just a matter of getting more people engaged on the issue. Another question I had is, you brought up a lot of regional markets, Midwest, mostly East Coast, and then the West Coast. So you're proposing, would you say that you're proposing something state specific for Louisiana, or do you see an opportunity for a regional market that Louisiana could either join or maybe start?
Yeah, so I wasn't able to include this in the PowerPoint because it's a whole nother rabbit hole. But essentially, Louisiana wouldn't be able to sustain a market by itself. Just with as much influence as the industry has here, if it ever got off the ground, it would be very short-lived. So I am imagining a regional program that Louisiana is either going to be a part of creating or joining. And I have some more information on this in my research, but essentially there is like the idea, the hint of some interest in Louisiana, Texas, and I think North Carolina. All of those states have some form of greenhouse gas reduction targets. I think Louisiana is the only state with an actual action plan, but my thinking is that if we, Louisiana, can find neighboring states that have greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets, this is one of our options to reach those targets. And so I'm thinking that if Louisiana, Texas, and it was either North or South Carolina, but we'll go with North Carolina. If Louisiana, Texas, and North Carolina all have these similar targets and maybe could be influenced to create a market like this, then it would potentially carry a lot more of the South, because obviously Texas has a huge amount of influence in the South. And I like to think Louisiana does somewhat, maybe not as much as Texas, but I'm thinking if those three states are the leaders in a program like this, it would be much more successful than if Louisiana tried to do this by itself, which, like I said, I don't think would last very long. And then the reason why I didn't go into that is because that's you start getting into convincing other states to get into the program, which is definitely easier said than done. But like I said, I do think it is possible, considering that all three of those states that I mentioned have those emissions reductions targets.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea to build out something regional. You know, if these states already have emissions targets, to target those, to say this is one way to meet those targets. I think that makes a lot of sense. All right, any other questions? Any other comments?
I really appreciate your intentionality in looking at what you think would be a great solution for our country versus what would be a good solution for Louisiana. I appreciate the fact that you want a solution that will work for Louisiana, so Louisiana will buy into it, because a lot of these things really aren't one size fits all. And this is a really great reminder that how localized climate action really can lead to greater change.
Right. Yeah. There's a reason I had 2 whole slides of criticisms for cap and trade. It is by no means perfect. But unfortunately, like you said, climate change action is very localized, and Louisiana is very far behind in that movement. So we have to start with baby steps, which is what I was imagining for my policy proposal. But more specifically, Louisiana has the unique problem of our emissions come from the industrial sector, which is, I'm sure y'all know, extremely difficult to reduce. And so Louisiana has to balance essentially like our complete lack of climate change infrastructure and an extremely difficult policy essentially to reduce those emissions. So it's a very uphill battle, which is why I went with the cap and trade program, because it is baby steps, but it still gets at the heart of Louisiana's core greenhouse gas emissions problems with our industry sector. There's plenty of other options for Louisiana to reduce our emissions in other sectors, like California did with their electricity sector. But we're already kind of taking steps towards that. And while those are in the works, I'm imagining we could theoretically start targeting like our biggest issue, because there's only so much you can do to reduce emissions that are like a small percentage of your total emissions. Essentially, like there's only so much reduction that you can do there, if that makes sense.
All right. Are there any other questions or comments before I give you all back your informal pop-in time?
I just want to say, Javen, like on behalf of TCI, Camryn, and Hunter, like thank you so much for all of your work.
Thank you all for having us.
Toolkits and the presentations. So it's been really great to have you.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciated the perspective and just like getting to chat with y'all weekly, bringing your perspective of how to balance the climate issues with the political realities of your states. And getting to think through those with these presentations, I think, and with the toolkits, I think has been really helpful to us as an org. So yeah, we've enjoyed having both of you, and I'm so excited to see what y'all end up doing next. So yeah, thank you so much, Camryn and Hunter, for the work y'all did, and I will give everyone else their all staff informal pop-in time, and I'll end the recording here. Thanks so much for the work that you've done.